Good afternoon, Bronzeville Classical School community. I am so excited to welcome you to our live stream event this afternoon. We are going to turn it over to Mr. Spears, our Golden Apple recipient for this year, about to start his sabbatical. We are just so excited that he's able to help us out with some special projects before he makes his transition for the remainder of the semester. So, without further ado, I want to welcome Mr. Spears to introduce our speaker. But before I do that and Mr. Spears jumps in, I do want to take this opportunity to send a special shout out to our Bronzeville Classical School families for taking the lead on planning some of our Black History School events. We would like to first shout out the Seaton family for submitting those Black History Month slides for each week that we share with our students during morning announcements. And then I'd like to shout out Dr. Kimya Barden, Mrs. Raynonda Townsend, Mr. Stephen Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, Ms. Cannon, and Mr. Spears, who really brought this Black History Month celebration events and calendar to life. Thank you so much for all of your tireless efforts to ensure that we are recognizing and celebrating our diversity as a school community. So without further ado, Mr. Spears, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Spicer. Good afternoon, everyone. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest for this afternoon. We are going to be joined by Dr. Zada Johnson. A lifelong Bronzeville resident, Dr. Johnson has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago and is presently associate professor and academic program coordinator of the Urban Community Studies program at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. Dr. Johnson's research includes the African diaspora cultures, African American performance traditions, New Orleans parading traditions, and urban culture and popular culture. We look forward to welcoming Dr. Johnson. Please give a nice round of applause in your classrooms for Dr. Zada Johnson. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
To be here and excited to talk about kids' creative power in historic Bronzeville. So are you ready? Are you ready for me to begin?
Are you there, Dr. Johnson?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Excellent. So I'm so excited to talk to you guys today about kids' creative power in historic Bronzeville. We're going to learn some exciting things about the wonderful things that kids can do.
Bronzeville. Go ahead, Dr. Johnson. I'm going to share your slides and you can go ahead and keep going.
Excellent.
Whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Spears, and congratulations, Mr. Spears.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about kids' creative power in historic Bronzeville. Bronzeville is a wonderful community filled with interesting history and people. As students at Bronzeville Classical Elementary School, you scholars probably already know that. But did you know that a lot of Bronzeville history was inspired by kids' creative power? Kids' creative power is a superpower that young people have to make their communities better. In Bronzeville, young people use their kids' creative power to help make an African American newspaper one of the most famous newspapers in the world. They also use their kids' creative power to start important youth social clubs and help develop the largest African American parade in the United States. I want you guys to look at these pictures and think about the things that you see in these pictures as we talk. And so this is one of my favorite pictures that you guys may have seen before. It's called Sunday Best. And a photographer took this picture in 1941 of young men who were outside of the Regal Theater on a Sunday afternoon after church. And I'll talk to you more about what they were doing. In the 1800s and early 1900s, many African Americans began moving to Chicago from southern states like Mississippi and Alabama in search of a better life. We call this event the Great Migration. During the Great Migration, thousands of African American children came to Chicago with their parents. So now look at these pictures and tell me, how many children do you see in these pictures? Moving to a new city was both scary and exciting. African Americans had to build their new lives as they found new jobs and lived in new communities. Their children went to new schools and looked for new fun and activities after school and during the summer. There was much to do to build a new life in Chicago. So the kids of Bronzeville put their kids' creative power to work. On the left-hand side, this picture should look stone houses on King Drive, which before it was Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, it was called South Parkway, and before then it was called Grand Boulevard. On the right, we have some kids playing out in Bronzeville. We're going to see what types of things kids were doing as they were getting their kids' creative power together. At school, the children of Bronzeville used their kids' creative power to work hard in their classes and earn good grades, a lot like you scholars. The schools in Chicago had nicer classrooms, better books, and more learning materials than the ones in the South. They also had better playgrounds and more activities, including sports, art, music, and dance. The children of Bronzeville understood that doing well in school was the first step in using their kids' creative power to make their communities better. And so we have a classroom on the left with young people learning in their new Chicago school in Bronzeville. And on the right, we have young people in a playground. Look at all of these children. As an anthropologist, I'm also interested in the way that they're dressed and the types of activities that they're engaged in. I am an anthropologist, which means that I study culture and I study the way people express themselves. Outside of school, the children of Bronzeville used their kids' creative power to become involved in community activities. One of the most important activities of the time was helping to sell the Chicago Defender newspaper. I can't see you scholars, but raise your hands if you've ever heard of the Chicago Defender. I think I hear some hands being raised, even though I can't see you. Founded by Robert Abbott in 1909, the Chicago Defender is one of the oldest African-American newspapers in the United States. The Chicago Defender was a very important part of Bronzeville community. It created jobs in the community and passed along important information about the Great Migration and African-American life during that time. Now, this picture, scholars, is one of my very favorites. It is a young man who is a Chicago Defender paper boy. And this is near and dear to my heart because my uncle was a Chicago Defender paper boy. And my mother also was a Chicago Defender paper girl. So she was one of the few girls that would go out and sell papers for the Chicago Defender. And this young man is actually standing just steps away from the house that my grandparents purchased when they were a part of the Great Migration and moved to Chicago, which is actually the house that I'm talking to you from right now. So if you see that Liberty, it looks like it spells Liberty in the background, that is the Liberty Life Insurance building, which is still standing at 35th and King Drive. The boys and girls who helped to sell the Chicago Defender were great at their jobs. They helped to keep the African-American community informed about important current events and opportunities that were available in Chicago. Their kids' creative power was so great that the Chicago Defender founder, Robert Abbott, decided to make Bronzeville children a central focus of the paper's community work. Some well-known Chicago Defender paper boys include Chicago historian Timuel Black, Reverend Leon Finney, and legendary jazz musician Nat King Cole. On the left-hand side of this slide, you will see Robert Abbott in the middle, looking very sharp in his suit and his little top hat. And you see the paper boys crowded around him. One of the things I love about this picture, young scholars, is the way that the paper boys are looking at Robert Abbott. They're looking at him like he is a great leader in their community, and he in fact was. On the other side, I just have a picture to show you kind of what paper boys did. They would put a sack across their shoulders with their papers inside, and they would walk up and down the streets and say, "Extra, extra, Chicago Defender." And or if they were my mom, they would put a sack across her side and they would say, "Extra, extra, Chicago Defender." And people would come and buy and read about the things that were going on in the African American community and in Bronzeville. Mr. Abbott was so impressed by the kids' creative power of Bronzeville that he hired a young writer to create a daily news column on the life of young people in the Bronzeville community. The young writer's name was Willard Motley, but his pen name for his column might sound familiar to you. It was Bud Billiken. Willard used outstanding kids' creative power to write interesting articles and encourage young people to write back to him so they would be featured in the paper. When Willard grew up, he became a famous writer and one of the first African Americans to have his novel made into a movie. Knock on Any Door was the name of his movie. And now I put this in for the teachers. I don't think my young scholars would be familiar with Humphrey Bogart, but Knock on Any Door was starring Humphrey Bogart, who was a big star at the time. And so this was a huge achievement for Mr. Motley as an African-American writer. Now, on the left side, you see Mr. Motley as a young Bud Billiken. On the right side, you see him as a grown-up author. And what I like is I like the way he's dressed as a young Bud Billiken. He looks very scholarly, very sharp. Willard Motley's Bud Billiken column was an instant success. There were so many young people writing letters and stories for him to put in his column that the Chicago Defender soon created the Bud Billiken Club, a kids' social club that encouraged young people to do well in school and become involved in their communities. The members of the club called themselves Billikens and wrote about their experiences in school as well as their artistic talents and future goals. The Bud Billiken Club became so popular that there were club members all over Chicago and all over the world, including the West Indies, Cuba, Paris, and Africa. Now that's real kids' creative power, scholars. They had the power to reach not only communities in Chicago and communities in the United States, but communities throughout the world. On the left side of this slide, you guys will see an actual copy of the application from the Chicago Defender to become a member of the Bud Billiken Club. On the right side, we have another one of my favorite pictures. These are young lady Billikens who received top billing and their pictures in the paper as talented Billikens. And these were young ladies who were musicians. One played the violin and the other played the flute. And so they got recognition for their great musical talent as well as their talent as good students. The Bud Billiken Club encouraged its members to appreciate literature, art, and science. And so again, I can't see you scholars, but I want you to raise your hands if you like literature. I think I hear some hands going up. Raise your hands if you like art. Dr. Johnson loves art. Raise your hands if you like science. Dr. Johnson loves science. Well, one of the rules of the Bud Billiken Club was that its members should be regular readers who had library cards and visited their local public library. During the times of historic Bronzeville, the main library branch was the George Cleveland Hall Library, named after African-American surgeon George Cleveland Hall, and it was located on 48th and Michigan Avenue. At the Hall branch, Billiken members would learn from Chicago's first African-American librarian, Miss Vivian Harsh, and meet famous African American authors like Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks. As they increased their knowledge at the library, Bronzeville children also increased their kids' creative power to make learning and activity both in and out of school. And so I want you guys to see in the middle that the Cleveland Hall branch is still in Chicago. It is still around. When I was a little girl, my mother would take me to the Cleveland Hall branch almost every weekend to check out books. And so it's a part of my wonderful Bronzeville memories, but it's also a part of Bronzeville history. If you look on the left, I wonder if there are any scholars who authors. Well, on the left side, the far left side, that is Miss Gwendolyn Brooks, one of my favorite authors. And as I showed in our initial slide or our first slide of the presentation, that was a copy of her book, Bronzeville Boys and Girls. And I heard that you guys have been reading Bronzeville Girls and Boys and Girls as well. That is excellent. On the right side of Miss Brooks, I wonder if anyone knows who that is. Can you guess? It's Langston Hughes. I think I heard somebody guess correctly. Excellent. On the far right slide, you'll see Mr. Langston Hughes with Bronzeville Boys and Girls holding their books up proudly. And so this was a big thing that the Bud Billiken Club would do. They would promote reading, and they would make sure that everyone had their library cards and that everyone used their local library. So now I'm wondering, where are my scholars that have their library cards? And where are my scholars that use their local public library? Excellent. The Bud Billiken Club also held fun activities for its members to attend. In Chicago, it hosted trips to the famous Regal Theater, dance parties, and picnics with free food, ice cream, and candy. In 1929, one of these events featured a small parade of Billiken Club members who marched from the Chicago Defender offices to the Regal Theater. This small parade grew in size every year and eventually became what we know today as the Bud Billiken Parade, the largest African American parade in the United States. In this case, the young people of Bronzeville used their kids' creative power to create a historic parade that still exists today. This is amazing to me, scholars, and I hope that it is just as amazing to you. On the left, here is a line of sharply dressed young Bronzeville residents waiting in line at the Regal Theater. I want you to look at what they have on. Don't they look sharp in their Sunday's best? Some of the young men are looking extra sharp with their hats on, with their suits, and the young ladies are looking so beautiful in their Sunday dresses and their Sunday coats. And so on the right side, I want you to see that these are young Bronzeville residents from contemporary times, even though the picture is in black and white. Every year, I'm not sure if you guys know, the Bud Billiken Parade has a king and a queen. And so this is one of the most recent kings and queens. In order to be a king and queen of the Bud Billiken Parade, you have to have excellent grades and make wonderful changes in your community and be a scholar who uses kids' creative power. Well, today we learned that through the help and hard work of kids' creative power in Bronzeville, African Americans were able to build new lives in Chicago during the Great Migration. The young people of historic Bronzeville used their awesome kids' creative power to do well in their new schools and help make the Chicago Defender one of the most important newspapers in the world. In addition, they used their awesome kids' creative power to increase their knowledge outside of school, develop the world famous Bud Billiken Club, and start the Bud Billiken Parade. We also learned today that many of the historic Bronzeville traditions that young people helped develop with their kids' creative power are still around today, like the Chicago Defender, the Cleveland Hall Branch Library, and the Bud Billiken Day Parade. And if you guys haven't guessed yet, the Bud Billiken Parade is one of my all-time favorite parades. I began going when I was about 3 years old on my uncle's shoulders, watching the various troops of young dancers and young military troops and all of the community organizations parading down King Drive. And so here we have some more modern pictures with some young men from the South Shore Drill Team, one of my favorite drill teams, and some young ladies from a local dance troupe dressed very sharply and doing their dance routine. If you guys out and see it, it is the city's back to school parade, and it often happens in August. And I'll tell you a secret: the current organizer of the Bud Billiken Day Parade is a former student of Dr. Johnson's. Well, now we have questions, scholars. We have talked about kids' creative power, and I want you to think about these questions and write some little notes about them as answers. So our first question is, how have you used your kids' creative power today? What have you done to use that power of education and knowledge and community awareness and making a change in your community? I bet you've done something today, or maybe even more than one thing today already. Our second question is, what did you learn about Bronzeville in this presentation? We talked about the Great Migration. We talked about historic Bronzeville. We talked about traditions and activities in Bronzeville, like the Bud Billiken Parade. We also talked about places in Bronzeville, like the Regal Theater and the Chicago Defender offices, which printed the Chicago Defender paper. So tell us what you learned today about Bronzeville in this presentation. And lastly, how will you use your kids' creative power to make your community better? So what are your future goals to make changes in your community? Dr. Johnson is unfortunately no longer a kid, but I would like to answer this question by saying that I reached back in time and I used my kids' creative power today to share the wonderful history of Bronzeville with my great scholars at Bronzeville Classical Elementary School. Thank you so much, scholars. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope it inspires you to continue to learn about Bronzeville.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We are so happy to have such a dynamic presentation about the history of Bronzeville for our scholars. I know our scholars come from all over the city, but we understand that Bronzeville has a special historical place in the development of the city of Chicago. So everybody benefits from Bronzeville, and everybody benefits from learning about the history of Bronzeville. So thank you, Dr. Johnson. We have some student questions if you've got a little bit of time for us.
Oh, excellent. I love questions from scholars.
Wonderful. Now, scholars, we know that several of you have submitted questions, and what we're going to do is we're not going to have time to have Dr. Johnson answer all of those questions. We're going to answer one or two questions, and then any other questions that have been submitted, we will send them to Dr. Johnson, and they will send us an answer, and we will present those answers during the morning announcements the rest of this month. And maybe in our history fact of the day or in our quote of the day segment during our morning announcements.
Excellent.
Well, I don't know if you can see Dr. Johnson, but you have some huge thank yous from room 115. That's our one of our kindergarten rooms. Says,
Yay,
thank
you. Thank you, 115.
So I'm going to share one of our questions. It comes from a second grader at our school, and their name is Lanila Kelly. And Lanila Kelly would like to know, we are learning about famous African Americans in class, and we have a new picture of Ida B. Wells in our school. Do you know any interesting facts about Ida B. Wells?
Yes, I do. So, Dr. Johnson lives one block behind the historic Ida B. Wells house. And Ida B. Wells is one of my heroes. I just bought the Ida B. Wells Barbie that just came out, and that is sitting proudly in my living room. She's even holding her newspaper. Ida B. Wells is very much like the founder of the Chicago Defender because she too was a writer, and she used her power of writing to make changes in the community and speak out about injustices. Ida B. Wells also was an activist for women's rights and women's suffrage, which is women's voting rights. And so if you are looking for a Bronzeville hero, Ida B. Wells is definitely a great choice.
Well, thank you for that information on Ida B. Wells. We have another question that was submitted by a third grader, and our third grader, Cole Madera, wants to know, how do you change the world when people don't agree with you?
You cut out, Mr. Spears.
Oh, I'm sorry. Third grader Cole Madera wants to know, how do you change the world when people don't agree with you?
Oh, that's an awesome question. You have to keep working. You have to be a good listener, and you also have to be a good communicator, because just because people don't agree with you doesn't mean that you can't work together. And so you have to listen to their points of view and then share your points of view as well and see if you can come to some agreement about how to move forward. That was good. That was a good
We have
question.
one. We have time for one more question. Let me pull it up here. And if there are any questions from our scholars in the classroom, teachers, if you're logged in to the YouTube page and can type those in the chat, we would love to have those to send to Dr. Johnson afterwards. Let's see. We have a question from a fourth grader this time, and it is from Jamari Brown. And Jamari would like to know, um, how do you want people to feel when people read your writing?
Wow, that's a great question. J. Meyer, you sound like a writer yourself. I want people to feel inspired. I want them to be happy about what they are reading, and I want them to go out and want to read and write more. One of the things that I say to my college students when I talk to them, when we sign off every day, I tell them happy reading and writing. And so, because reading and writing is so important in our community, and it's so important for us to be scholars, I want my readers to be inspired, and I want them to go forth and want to share more knowledge in their writing.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your time
Excellent.
this afternoon. We are so appreciative and so fortunate to have had you this afternoon to give us a wonderful presentation on the history of Bronzeville. Early on in our career as a school, we actually did a walking tour of Bronzeville. So some of our scholars who have been with us for the last 3 years were on that trip and should recognize some of the places and things that you talked about in your presentation. So we hope to continue building that relationship with our community that we're in. And hopefully you'll be able to come and see our school and meet the students and all of us in person, and give us some more wonderful information about Bronzeville. So I just want to say thank you again so much. Principal Spicer, did you want to close out with any closing remarks?
Absolutely. I just wanted to say thank you again to Dr. Johnson for carving out some time for Bronzeville Classical School. We have an amazing school community. We would love to welcome you. I've kind of put you on the hook. I don't know if you've seen the chat, but I did tell the children that you do know Ida B. Wells's great-great-great granddaughter.
Yes.
We're going to put us in contact with her so
Yes.
that the students can get to meet her. Mr. Spears mentioned our community walk. And hopefully with everybody wearing their mask and taking their vaccinations, we can get back to our community walk, which is a major part of our spring semester. But we are just incredibly humbled that you made time for us. And thank you for inspiring our children to use their kids' creative power every day, not just some days, but every day, and finding those small moments to do so. It was an absolute pleasure. I'll turn it over to Mr. Spears to maybe do some class shout outs, because we know all of our classes are actively engaged, and then we can let you get back to enjoying the rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. We'll end there on that wonderful high note. For those of you who are watching in our community, thank you for joining us during this broadcast. This should be available on our BCS YouTube page going forward. So if you want to watch it back and get some more information that you may have missed, we'd love you to do that. Thank you again, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Principal Spicer, and the Black History Month committee who helped put this together. We're so appreciative of that. We have more to come the rest of the month. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Have a great afternoon. Everyone out there, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, scholars. Keep up the great work.